Imagine living above a hidden dungeon for 24 years, never knowing that your own husband is keeping your daughter prisoner in the basement below your feet. For over 2 decades, Josef Fritzl raped his daughter Elisabeth over 3,000 times, fathered 7 children with her, and convinced his wife and the world that Elisabeth had run away to join a cult. This Austrian monster created a secret underground prison beneath his family home and committed crimes so horrific that when the truth finally emerged in 2008, it shocked the entire world and redefined our understanding of human evil. You're about to hear how one man's twisted obsession destroyed multiple lives, how a routine hospital visit finally exposed decades of unthinkable abuse, and how the nice neighbor everyone trusted became the face of Austria's greatest shame. This case proves that the most dangerous monsters aren't hiding in dark alleys, they're living in ordinary houses, wearing respectable faces, while committing unspeakable horrors right under everyone's noses. Stay with me, because this story will change how you see evil forever. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935, in Imprisoned, Lower Austria, during a time when the country was struggling with economic hardship and social upheaval. From the outside, his childhood appeared unremarkable, but like many who grow up to commit unthinkable crimes, the seeds of his future depravity were planted early in toxic soil that would nurture his worst impulses. Fritzl grew up as an only child, raised primarily by his mother after his father largely abandoned the family responsibilities. His relationship with his mother was reportedly complex and troubled, marked by both dependency and resentment that would later manifest in his twisted views about women and control. The absence of a strong, positive male role model and the dynamics of his early family relationships would contribute to the psychological dysfunction that would eventually destroy so many lives. As a young man, Fritzl demonstrated the kind of superficial charm and manipulative intelligence that often characterizes successful predators. He was able to function in society, hold jobs, and maintain relationships while harboring increasingly dark fantasies about power, control, and domination. To his neighbors and acquaintances, he appeared to be a respectable, hard-working Austrian citizen who was building a life and a family in the traditional mold. In 1956, Fritzl married Rosemary, a woman who would unknowingly spend decades living above one of the most horrific crimes in modern history. The couple settled in Imprisoned, where Fritzl worked as a technician and began building what would become both a family home and a secret prison. To the outside world, they appeared to be a normal married couple working to establish themselves in their community. Fritzl's ability to compartmentalize his life and present different faces to different people was extraordinary and terrifying. He could be a functioning member of society during the day while planning and implementing unspeakable horrors in private. This dual existence would continue for decades, demonstrating a level of psychological control and deception that defies normal human understanding. In the 1970s, Josef Fritzl began what would later be revealed as systematic preparation for one of the most prolonged and horrific crimes in recorded history. Under the guise of home renovation and improvement, Fritzl began constructing a complex of hidden rooms and passages beneath his family home in Imprisoned. What his wife and neighbors believed was simply basement renovation was actually the creation of a sophisticated prison designed to hold human beings in complete isolation from the outside world. The construction project took years to complete and required extensive planning and engineering. Fritzl installed reinforced doors, soundproofing, ventilation systems, and all the infrastructure necessary to maintain human life in underground captivity. The level of premeditation involved in this construction project revealed that his plans were not impulsive or spontaneous, they were the result of years of careful planning and preparation. Austrian police later revealed that Fritzl had been planning to imprison his daughter when she was just 12 years old, indicating that his crimes were not crimes of opportunity but were instead the culmination of years of twisted fantasy and meticulous preparation. The psychological profile that emerged showed a man who had been nurturing increasingly dark obsessions for years before he had the means and opportunity to act on them. What makes this case particularly chilling is the domestic setting in which these crimes occurred. This wasn't a remote location or an abandoned building, it was the basement of a family home in a residential neighborhood, with other family members living directly above the hidden prison. The proximity of normal family life to such extraordinary evil creates a cognitive dissonance that challenges our fundamental assumptions about safety and security. Elisabeth Fritzl was born in 1966, the fourth of Josef and Rosemary Fritzl's 7 children. From an early age, Elisabeth displayed the kind of independent spirit and strong will that may have both attracted her father's twisted attention and made her a target for his need to dominate and control. She was described as intelligent, creative, and determined to make her own choices about her life and future. As Elisabeth entered her teenage years, she began to chafe against her father's increasingly controlling behavior and restrictive rules. She was ambitious and wanted to pursue her own interests and relationships, which put her in direct conflict with Fritzl's desire to maintain complete authority over his family. This conflict would ultimately seal her fate and lead to a captivity that would last nearly a quarter century. In 1983, when Elisabeth was 16 years old, her father sexually assaulted her for the first time. This initial attack was both a crime in itself and a prelude to the systematic abuse that would follow. The assault established Fritzl's dominance over his daughter and began the psychological conditioning that would make her extended captivity possible. Elisabeth tried to escape her father's control by running away from home, but she was caught and returned. This unsuccessful attempt to flee may have convinced Fritzl that more drastic measures were necessary to ensure his complete control over his daughter. The failed escape also demonstrated Elisabeth's awareness that her home was not safe and her recognition that her father posed a serious threat to her well-being. On August 28, 1984, Josef Fritzl told his wife Rosemary that their 18-year-old daughter Elisabeth had run away from home and joined a religious cult. To support this story, he produced what appeared to be a letter from Elisabeth explaining her departure and asking her family not to look for her. What Rosemary didn't know was that her husband had forced Elisabeth to write this letter under duress before imprisoning her in the basement dungeon he had spent years constructing. The story Fritzl told was carefully crafted to explain Elisabeth's disappearance while discouraging intensive searching or police involvement. By claiming that she had joined a cult voluntarily, he provided an explanation that, while concerning, didn't necessarily indicate criminal activity. The supposed letter from Elisabeth reinforced this narrative and gave Fritzl plausible deniability if questions were raised about her whereabouts. In reality, Elisabeth had been drugged, chained, and locked in the soundproof basement dungeon that would become her entire world for the next 24 years. The underground complex consisted of several small rooms with reinforced doors, minimal furnishing, and no natural light. Elisabeth was completely cut off from the outside world, with no means of communication or escape, entirely dependent on her father for food, water, and basic survival needs. The initial period of Elisabeth's captivity was designed to break her spirit and establish the psychological control that would make her long-term imprisonment possible. Fritzl used a combination of physical violence, psychological manipulation, and complete isolation to crush any thoughts of resistance or escape. He convinced Elisabeth that any attempt to flee would result in deadly consequences for both her and other family members. Over the next 24 years, Fritzl repeatedly raped his daughter and fathered 7 children with her, subjecting Elisabeth to an estimated 3,000 sexual assaults. The systematic nature of this abuse reveals a level of cruelty and depravity that challenges our understanding of human capacity for evil. Elisabeth was not just physically imprisoned, she was psychologically destroyed and rebuilt as a completely controlled victim. The conditions of Elisabeth's captivity were deliberately harsh and dehumanizing. She was kept in a windowless basement with minimal lighting, poor ventilation, and inadequate sanitation facilities. Food was provided irregularly and was often withheld as punishment for perceived infractions or resistance. The psychological torture was constant, with Fritzl maintaining complete control over every aspect of Elisabeth's existence. The basement prison contained basic amenities including a television, radio, video cassette player, refrigerator, and hot plate to heat food, which would be withheld for days at a time as punishment. These limited comforts were used as tools of control rather than genuine attempts to improve living conditions. Fritzl could remove any of these privileges at will, maintaining psychological dominance over his captive daughter. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Elisabeth's ordeal was her role as a mother to the children born from her father's repeated rapes. Despite the horrific circumstances of their conception and birth, Elisabeth developed fierce protective instincts toward her children and worked to shield them from the worst aspects of their underground existence. She became their primary caregiver, educator, and emotional support system in an environment that was completely unsuitable for child development. Of the 7 children Elisabeth bore, 3 were kept in the basement with her, while Fritzl and his wife Rosemary raised 3 others upstairs, with 1 child dying in infancy. This arrangement allowed Fritzl to maintain his double life while ensuring that some of the children could serve as proof of Elisabeth's supposed life in the cult. The children raised upstairs were told their mother had abandoned them, adding another layer of psychological cruelty to an already unthinkable situation. Throughout Elisabeth's 24-year captivity, Josef Fritzl maintained an elaborate deception that convinced his wife, his community, and Austrian authorities that his daughter was living freely as a member of a religious cult. This deception required constant maintenance and demonstrated Fritzl's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social expectations. Periodically, Fritzl would produce letters supposedly written by Elisabeth, updating the family on her life in the cult and explaining why she couldn't return home or maintain regular contact. These letters, written under duress by Elisabeth herself, served to maintain the illusion and discourage deeper investigation into her disappearance. The content of these letters was carefully designed to explain ongoing absence while maintaining the fiction of voluntary separation. The most audacious aspect of Fritzl's deception involved the children born to Elisabeth during her captivity. When he decided to bring some of the children upstairs to live with his wife, Fritzl claimed that Elisabeth had left them on the family doorstep because she could no longer care for them while living in the cult. Rosemary, completely unaware of the true situation, accepted these children into her home and raised them as her grandchildren. This arrangement served multiple purposes for Fritzl. It provided cover for the existence of children born in captivity, it reinforced the story about Elisabeth's life in the cult, and it allowed him to maintain relationships with some of his victims while keeping others hidden. The complexity of this deception demonstrates both Fritzl's manipulative intelligence and the extent to which he had planned and refined his crime over many years. The beginning of the end for Josef Fritzl's decades-long deception came in April 2008, when one of Elisabeth's children became seriously ill and required emergency medical treatment. 19-year-old Kirsten, one of the children who had spent her entire life in the basement with Elisabeth, developed a life-threatening condition that could not be treated in the underground prison. Faced with the choice of allowing his granddaughter to die or seeking medical help that might expose his crimes, Fritzl decided to take Kirsten to a local hospital. He told medical staff that the girl was his granddaughter, abandoned by her mother who was involved with a cult, and that he had no medical information about her background or condition. The hospital staff were immediately suspicious of Fritzl's story and concerned about Kirsten's unusual medical presentation and apparent lack of exposure to sunlight or normal environmental conditions. Her physical condition was consistent with someone who had spent years in confined, artificial conditions, raising red flags among medical professionals who had never encountered anything quite like her case. When doctors insisted they needed to speak with Kirsten's mother to obtain necessary medical information, Fritzl was forced to return to the basement and bring Elisabeth to the hospital. After 24 years of imprisonment, Elisabeth finally emerged from the underground dungeon that had been her entire world since she was 18 years old. Elisabeth's arrival at the hospital on April 26, 2008, marked the beginning of one of the most shocking revelations in criminal history. Medical staff immediately recognized that something was seriously wrong with the situation. Elisabeth appeared to be suffering from extreme psychological trauma, was unnaturally pale from years without sunlight, and exhibited behavior consistent with long-term abuse and isolation. When hospital staff separated Elisabeth from her father and began questioning her privately, the truth began to emerge. After decades of psychological conditioning and fear, Elisabeth initially found it difficult to reveal the full extent of her ordeal. However, the combination of being in a safe environment and the urgent medical needs of her daughter gradually gave her the strength to speak. The story that Elisabeth told was so horrific that medical staff and law enforcement officers initially struggled to believe it could be true. The idea that someone could be held captive for 24 years in the basement of a family home, in a residential neighborhood, while bearing 7 children to her own father, seemed almost impossible to comprehend. However, as Elisabeth provided more details and as investigators began examining the physical evidence, the truth of her account became undeniable. The sophisticated basement prison, the forged letters, the birth certificates of children with impossible genealogies, all of these pieces of evidence supported Elisabeth's testimony and revealed the full scope of Fritzl's crimes. Police arrested Josef Fritzl on the night of April 26, 2008, and after his arrest, the children remaining in the cellar were also released. The arrest marked the end of one of the longest-running kidnapping and imprisonment cases in modern history and the beginning of a legal proceeding that would captivate and horrify the international community. Initially, Fritzl claimed that his behavior toward his daughter did not constitute rape, but was consensual, demonstrating a complete disconnect from reality and an inability to comprehend the nature of his crimes. This claim revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance and his inability to understand that consent cannot exist in the context of imprisonment, coercion, and a parent-child relationship. Josef Fritzl was charged with 6 counts including murder, incest, rape, false imprisonment, and enslavement. The murder charge related to the death of one of the infants born to Elisabeth, who died due to lack of proper medical care, a death that could have been prevented if the child had received appropriate treatment in a hospital setting. Elisabeth's recorded 11-hour testimony was so harrowing that some jurors had to watch it in short bursts, demonstrating the psychological impact of her ordeal not just on the victim and her family, but on everyone who learned the details of what she had endured. The testimony provided a complete account of 24 years of systematic abuse, rape, and psychological torture that defied normal human comprehension. Elisabeth's videotaped testimony described her years of torment, repeatedly raped by her father and trapped with the children of incest in a dank cellar, and it was so harrowing that it led her father to confess. The power of her testimony and the undeniable evidence of his crimes eventually broke through Fritzl's attempts at denial and manipulation. In March 2009, Fritzl pleaded guilty to all counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was convicted of incest, rape, coercion, false imprisonment, enslavement, and negligent homicide and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years before possible parole. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the court's recognition that he posed a danger to society. When Elisabeth finally emerged in 2008, the story of Fritzl's sadism shocked the world. The case became international news and prompted discussions about child protection, family violence, and the ways that abuse can remain hidden even in seemingly normal communities. The story challenged assumptions about family dynamics and raised questions about how such extensive abuse could remain undetected for so long. The case had particular impact in Austria, where it became a source of national shame and prompted soul-searching about Austrian society and institutions. The idea that such a crime could occur in a small Austrian town raised uncomfortable questions about social oversight, community responsibility, and the effectiveness of child protection systems. The case drew comparisons to other long-term abduction cases, including that of J.C. Duguid, highlighting patterns in how predators isolate and control their victims over extended periods. These comparisons helped experts and law enforcement better understand the psychology of long-term captivity and the methods used by predators to maintain control over victims. The rescue of Elisabeth and her children marked the beginning of a long and complex recovery process that continues to this day. After 24 years of isolation and abuse, Elisabeth and her children faced the enormous challenge of adjusting to life in the outside world while dealing with severe psychological trauma. The basement where the crimes occurred was eventually sealed with concrete, literally burying